In the quiet valleys of Bavaria, where the mountains rise like silent sentinels and the rivers glimmer with pale moonlight, there once stood a village known less for its grandeur than for its peace. But in a single night, that peace was shattered, and the name of the place carried whispers for half a century. The story begins not with famine, nor with war, but with joy, the celebration of a wedding. The groom was a nobleman of modest fortune yet proud lineage, and the bride the daughter of a wealthy landholder. Their union promised prosperity, their love a bridge between families. And so, in the autumn of that year, the halls of the local fortress were dressed in splendor. Tapestries hung heavy on the walls, their crimson threads glowing in candlelight. Musicians tuned their lutes and viols, cooks worked by firelight, their tables groaning beneath roasts of venison, loaves of dark bread, wheels of cheese, and barrels of foaming beer. The villagers and noble guests alike flocked to the feast. Lanterns flickered in the dusk as wagons rolled up the hill bearing families dressed in their best. Laughter echoed against the stone, and the air swelled with song. It was said the banquet tables stretched so long that no man could see the end from where he sat today. There was meat for every plate, wine for every hand, and music enough to make the floor tremble beneath the dancers' feet. And yet, amid the joy, there were whispers. The old women muttered of ill omens, the cry of an owl at dawn, the sudden withering of the bridal flowers, the flicker of candles that refused to stay lit. Some swore the bride herself had woken in tears, claiming she had dreamed of a hall filled with smoke and silence. But such things were brushed aside with laughter. Who heeds shadows on a day of light? As the sun fell and torches blazed, the feast began in earnest. Toasts were raised, goblets clashed, and the music swelled to fill every vaulted corner. The bride, pale and radiant, smiled beneath her veil. The groom, flushed with pride and drink, boasted that their marriage would be remembered for generations. He was not wrong. It would be remembered, but not as he imagined. For beneath the clamor of joy, something unseen stirred, like a shadow waiting at the edge of the firelight. The fortress that night was a jewel set against the blackness of the Bavarian hills. Torches burned in iron sconces along the courtyard, and from within came the warmth of firelight and the fragrance of roasted meat. The banquet tables bent beneath the weight of abundance, boar turning on spits, trout pulled fresh from the river, platters of spiced sausages and steaming dumplings, pitchers of honeyed mead. Silver goblets caught the glow of the flames, throwing shards of light across the vaulted ceiling. Every detail spoke of prosperity and joy. The guests filled the hall with noise and motion. Nobles in brocaded tunics laughed loudly over their wine. Peasants, permitted into the feast by the bride's generous father, danced to the rhythm of fiddles and drums. The air shook with merriment, and yet, if one looked closely, shadows clung to the corners where the torchlight faltered. There, the faces of the older villagers were less merry. They sipped their drink slowly, watching the hall with wary eyes, as if they had seen something like this before. It was in the midst of the revelry that the first uneasy signs appeared. The flames of the candles trembled without wind, sputtering and dying only to flare again as though unseen fingers toyed with them. Dogs chained outside howled into the night, their cries cutting through the music with chilling precision. Some said the draught that swept the room carried not the warmth of fire, but the cold breath of the grave. The musicians played on, their notes defiant against the unease, and the dancers spun faster, as if to drown out the dread. Yet whispers wound their way through the crowd. An aunt of the bride murmured that the bridal veil had torn just before it was placed upon her head, a sign of misfortune. Another spoke of a wine cask that split open in the cellar with no blade nor hand to wound it. "The spirits are displeased," muttered a grey-haired villager, crossing herself as she spoke. The bride and groom, flushed with wine and youth, dismissed such talk. She clutched his arm as they moved among their guests, her smile polite but tight at the edges. He raised his goblet again and again, promising prosperity, children, and a long life together. His voice rang boldly across the hall, but some swore that when he looked away, the pride in his eyes was replaced by something more fragile, fear he dared not speak aloud. As the night deepened, the unease grew. The banquet had all the trappings of joy, yet beneath it lay a dissonance, a trembling in the air that no music could soothe. The villagers, seated nearest the walls, leaned closer to one another, their voices low. They remembered tales of old, of celebrations that ended not in laughter but in mourning. Still, no one rose to leave. The abundance of food, the richness of wine, the weight of tradition, all bound them to their seats. And so the feast continued, blazing brighter even as the omens thickened. Light and shadow danced together in uneasy truce, as though fate itself stood at the threshold, waiting for the moment to step inside. It began without warning. One moment the hall roared with laughter and song, the clatter of goblets and the stamping of dancers' feet. The next, a sharp cry pierced the air, and a man collapsed across the table, his wine spilling into the candles. At first, the guests laughed nervously, thinking him drunk, until his body convulsed violently and foam gathered at his lips. His wife screamed, and then like a chorus of doom the cries began multiplying. Guests tumbled from their seats, clutching their throats, their faces twisted in terror. Some vomited blood across the white tablecloths. Others staggered backward as their eyes rolled to the whites. The hall, moments before a cathedral of joy, became a theatre of death. Platters crashed to the floor, goblets shattered, and bodies writhed among the spilled food. The musicians dropped their instruments, the violins wailed one last shrill note before silence fell, broken only by the chaos of dying voices. The bride stood frozen, her veil trembling as her hands gripped the table. The groom tried to steady her, but his own knees buckled. He fell to the ground, clawing at his chest, gasping as if drowning in unseen waters. The bride shrieked his name, collapsing beside him, her pale gown darkened by spilled wine and blood. Around them, their guests screamed in agony, some thrashing, others going still, their eyes glassy with finality. Panic spread like fire. Some ran for the doors, but the great wooden gates would not yield. Whether bolted from outside or cursed from within, no hand could force them open. Guests beat upon them with fists and knives, but the iron bands held, and their desperate pounding was drowned by the wails of those already falling to the ground. The torches flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The stones seemed to pulse with the cries of the dying. Men clawed at their throats until their nails tore skin. Women clutched their children, trying to shield them, only to watch them collapse in their arms. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of sickness and fear. By midnight, the hall was a charnel house. Corpses lay slumped over benches, sprawled across the dance floor, piled near the doors where they had tried to escape. Blood streaked the floorboards, mingling with wine and meat, until the once celebratory feast became an altar of death. Only the crackle of the fire remained, indifferent to the carnage. Witnesses, those few who lingered long enough to tell the tale, spoke of final, dreadful visions. They swore they saw figures moving in the smoke, as if invisible guests had joined the feast, claiming their share of the living. One survivor, a stable boy who had hidden in the rafters, insisted he heard laughter in the wind, laughter that did not belong to any mortal voice. By dawn, silence reigned. Of the dozens who had come to celebrate, none remained alive upon the floor of the hall. Bride and groom lay side by side, their hands stretched toward one another but not quite touching. Their faces were pale masks, their eyes open, as if staring at some terrible truth beyond the veil of death. Outside, villagers gathered in fearful awe. No one dared to enter. The doors creaked open only when the sun struck the highest tower, and what they found inside seared itself into memory. A wedding turned into a tomb, joy transfigured into horror. From that day forward, the hall was cursed not only by rumor, but by the testimony of all who beheld the aftermath. And so the tragedy was etched into the chronicles of the land. A night when music died, love withered, and every guest became a mourner for themselves. Bavaria had known famine, had known war, but nothing as cruel as this. A celebration turned to mass grave in the space of a single night. The tragedy left the land in stunned silence. For weeks after the wedding feast, the fortress stood locked, its gates barred as if to contain the memory of what had occurred inside. The villagers dared not enter. Even the priests hesitated to step across the threshold. Those few who did spoke of an air so heavy it clung to the skin, of tables still laden with rotting food, of goblets overturned beside lifeless bodies, their eyes staring into nothingness. The smell of smoke and blood lingered like a shroud. At first the people called it punishment. They whispered that God himself had turned his face from the revelers, disgusted by their vanity and their indulgence. The abundance of the feast had been too great, the pride of the families too loud. Others believed the devil had come as an unseen guest, slipping poison into the goblets, laughing as mortals toasted to their own demise. Each retelling of the tale grew darker, and the villagers clung to these beliefs, for mystery was more bearable than uncertainty. But among the few who sought reason, another explanation took shape. Local healers, those who studied the harvest, pointed to the bread and beer served in abundance that night. The grains, they said, might have been tainted with ergot, a mold that thrived in damp fields. Invisible to the eye, it poisoned the blood, causing convulsions, visions, and death. Centuries later, scholars would compare it to the madness of Street Anthony's fire, a disease that drove villages into fits of terror. Could it be that the wedding feast was not cursed by spirits, but by fungus born of the earth itself? Yet reason did little to soothe the soul. For the people of Bavaria, science had no place in their grief. They had seen the way candles died without cause, the way dogs howled at the very hour the feast began. They had heard stories of the bride's nightmare, of flowers that withered before the ceremony. These were not the marks of disease, they argued, but of a curse laid upon the house itself. And so fear spread wider than the sickness ever could. Parents warned their children against celebrating too loudly, lest they attract the same fate. Couples hesitated to wed, terrified their joy would invite disaster. Priests refused to bless large gatherings. For half a century, the bells of marriage were silent in that valley. No processions wound through the streets, no feast tables were laid. Love was whispered in shadows, vows exchanged in secret, but never in public where the curse might hear. The fortress where the wedding had taken place became a place of dread. Travelers passing by at night swore they heard music drifting from its broken windows, faint strains of fiddles and lutes, followed by the echo of screams. Others claimed to see figures moving in the torchlight within, though the halls were empty. To some it was the souls of the wedding guests, trapped in eternal celebration. To others it was a warning, a reminder that joy can be devoured by death in an instant. 50 years is a long time, yet the shadow of that night stretched across generations. Children grew into adults without ever seeing a wedding in their village. Elders died with the memory still fresh in their eyes. And when outsiders asked why the valley was so quiet, the villagers told the story not with laughter, but with trembling voices, as though to speak it too loudly might awaken the curse once more. In the decades that followed, the valley carried its silence like a second skin. Life continued, harvests were sown, markets bustled, children were born, but one sound was forever missing: the peal of wedding bells. No music of processions, no garlands strung across doors, no laughter spilling into the streets. In that place, love was not celebrated with feasts or dances. It was whispered in shadows, exchanged with furtive glances, sealed not by ritual but by fear. The old fortress, once a symbol of pride, crumbled slowly into ruin. Ivy crept up its walls, owls nested in its towers, and storms rattled its broken shutters. Yet to the villagers, it remained alive. On windless nights, they swore they heard strains of music, violins wailing, drums beating faintly, as if the feast continued behind stone long since abandoned. And beneath that music came other sounds: the clatter of goblets, the thud of collapsing bodies, and the echo of screams carried on the night air. Children were told never to wander too close, lest the spirits mistake them for missing guests and drag them inside. Travelers who lingered claimed they saw candlelight flickering in the high windows, though no soul had entered in years. A pale bride, veil torn, was said to wander the courtyard, her face hidden but her gown stained red. The groom, too, was seen head bowed, goblet in hand, forever raising a toast that no one dared return. With each generation the story deepened. Some told it as divine judgment, God striking down a people too arrogant in their abundance. Others whispered that the devil himself had walked among them, poisoning their bread and wine, claiming the revelers for his eternal court. A few, more practical, insisted it was ergot, a sickness of the grain, a cruel trick of nature mistaken for wrath. But whatever the explanation, the truth became irrelevant. What endured was the fear, and so the wedding that was meant to bind two families instead bound an entire valley in silence. 50 years passed before another marriage was dared in Bavaria. Even then, the bells rang timidly, their sound half drowned by the memory of what had come before. The feast was modest, the guests few, and the laughter uncertain. For every cup raised in joy, another was lowered in dread. Today, the ruins still stand, cloaked in ivy and shadow, their stones steeped in memory. To walk there is to feel the weight of eyes unseen, to hear the faint rustle of silk and the echo of music long since faded. The locals call it the wedding of blood, a story not merely of death, but of how joy can be undone in a single night. And when the tale is told, it ends always the same, with a warning whispered softly, as though the walls themselves are listening. Beware the feast that burns too bright, for in Bavaria, even love can be cursed.